Well, I think it shows that they weren't really on the job. Either there was a failure in communication or there was a deliberate decision not to share information about the extent of the Chinese foreign interference.
Welcome back to Northern Perspective, everyone. I'm Cypher.
And I'm Fox. The public inquiry into foreign interference was in full swing this week, and we heard some incredible testimony. What we also heard is the beginning of an answer that we have been asking since February of last year. Why has Justin Trudeau and his Liberal government been so afraid of having a public inquiry into foreign interference? Global News has come right out and said what Pierre Poilievre was saying all along. David Johnston was brought in to cover for his longtime friend Justin Trudeau, and that the government is now caught with its pants down. We begin with a Global News article published on Friday, April 5th. New foreign interference documents raise questions about Special Rapporteur report. New intelligence documents published by the Federal Foreign Interference Inquiry raise questions about the conclusions of former Governor General David Johnston's probe into the issue. Johnston, whom Prime Minister Justin Trudeau appointed as Special Rapporteur on Foreign Interference, ruled out calling a public inquiry last May. Had Johnston's recommendation been accepted, a trove of national security documents released this week by the Foreign Interference Commission would have never seen the light of day. This new information, submitted by CSIS, highlights allegations of the People's Republic of China, or PRC, quote, highly capable and motivated, end quote, activities against Canada's democratic processes and institutions. Some of that information appears to directly challenge Johnston's interpretation of top secret intelligence and the extent of foreign interference operations, principally by Beijing, in Canada. A spokesperson for Johnston said Friday he, quote, is not responding to any further media inquiries about his role as independent special rapporteur, end quote. Late Thursday afternoon, David Vigneault, the director of the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, or CSIS, revealed that they had intelligence that alleges that Beijing tried to funnel approximately $250,000 to interfere with the 2019 general election. While CSIS offered no evidence that money changed hands, the summary it put forth suggests the money was intended to be dispersed through an alleged interference network, including an influential community member, a staff member of a 2019 federal candidate, and an unnamed Ontario MPP. The intelligence suggests that the money was meant to benefit 11 campaigns, including 7 Liberal and 4 Conservative candidates. Global News first reported the existence of the alleged $250,000 fund in 2022, citing unnamed national security sources. But in his report released last May, Johnston called the reporting, quote, inflammatory. Quote, it appears from limited intelligence that the PRC intended for funds to be sent to 7 Liberal and 4 Conservative federal candidates through a community organization, political staff, and, possibly unwittingly, a Progressive Conservative Party of Ontario MP, end quote, Johnston's report read. Quote, the Prime Minister pointed out that he is not briefed on matters that are not supported by reliable intelligence. No recommendations were made to any minister or the Prime Minister about this allegation, and therefore no recommendations were ignored, end quote. During Thursday's hearing, Vigneault did give the caveat that intelligence is not evidence, and that the alleged $250,000 in funding may require further investigation. But the spy chief nevertheless said his words were, quote, carefully chosen to make sure that CSIS are providing the Commissioner and Canadians with the most accurate possible depiction of what we know while protecting classified information, end quote. The spy agency's assessment was that the funds were possibly, quote, for foreign interference-related purposes, though most likely not an attempt to covertly fund the 11 candidates, end quote. Both Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and his National Security and Intelligence Advisor, Jody Thomas, repeatedly said that there was no evidence that money allegedly changed hands, but did acknowledge the government knew about the money. On Tuesday, the inquiry heard CSIS had intelligence that Chinese international students who went to a private high school were bussed in to vote in former Liberal MP Han Dong's 2019 nomination contest in the Toronto area riding of Don Valley North, as first reported by Global News. Dong did not mention the buses in his initial interview with the commission 6 weeks prior to the hearing. Dong instead told the commission the day before his testimony. Quote, "I was reminded by my wife," end quote, Dong said on Tuesday. In his May report, however, Johnston called busing voters standard practice. Quote, "Reports of buses of people brought to nomination meetings may be a surprise to the less initiated, but numerous people with a campaign experience told us that there are always buses and wondered whether they get more attention when they contain racialized Canadians," end quote, his report read. But a CSIS intelligence summary presented to the inquiry this week suggested that the students may not have lived in Dong's riding, were provided with fake identification, and had been coerced into voting. Quote, "Some intelligence reporting also indicated that the students were provided with falsified documents to allow them to vote, despite not being residents of DVN, aka Don Valley North. The documents were provided by individuals associated with a known proxy agent," end quote, the summary read. Quote, "Intelligence reported after the election indicated that veiled threats were issued by the PRC consulate to the Chinese international students, implying their visas would be in jeopardy and that there could be consequences for their families back in the PRC if they did not support Han Dong," end quote. Dong said he was told about the bus and presumed it had been organized by the school itself. Quote, "I didn't pay attention to busing international students because I didn't understand it as an irregularity," end quote, he said. Johnston's report noted that while, quote, "irregularities were observed with Mr. Dong's nomination," end quote, in 2019, and that there were, quote unquote, well-grounded suspicions those irregularities were tied to the PRC consulate in Toronto, Johnston, quote, "did not find evidence that Mr. Dong was aware of those irregularities or the PRC consulate's potential involvement in his nomination," end quote. Dong denied any knowledge of the students using falsified documents to vote in the nomination. Quote, "I would be the first one condemning it. I think it's an insult to our democratic system," end quote, he said. Asked if he accepted that the PRC was attempting to interfere in Canadian politics, Dong said he had, quote, "seen reports about that," end quote, but he had not personally, quote, "seen any evidence of it," end quote. On Tuesday, the inquiry heard Canada's spy agency recorded a phone call between Dong and China's Consul General in Toronto discussing the detention of the two Michaels in early 2021 when the Canadians were still in custody. The document, primarily created by CSIS, is described as a quote-unquote incomplete intelligence, and its allegations have not been proven despite having a recording of the phone conversation. Global News first reported in March 2023, citing unnamed national security sources, that Dong spoke to a Chinese diplomat at the Toronto consulate about the detention of the two Michaels and advised against their immediate release. Dong had disputed those claims and is suing Chorus Entertainment, Global's parent company. In a CSIS summary of the conversation, Dong allegedly speculated to the diplomat that if the Chinese government freed the Canadians right away, it would bolster the quote-unquote hardline approach to Canada-China relations, whereas more quote-unquote transparency about their detention would placate public opinion and give the Liberal government quote-unquote talking points. Quote, "Mr. Dong expressed the view that even if the PRC released the two Michaels at that moment, opposition parties would view the PRC's action as an affirmation of the effectiveness of a hardline Canadian approach to the PRC," end quote, read the CSIS intelligence summary. The declassified document also alleges Dong, quote, "stressed that any transparency provided by the PRC in relation to the two Michaels, such as a court hearing or a court date, would help to placate Canadian public opinion and provide some valuable talking points to his own political party against the opposition," end quote. Dong testified that he didn't recall making those statements, but added the information in the summary, quote, "didn't make a lot of sense," end quote. The MP also maintained that he has always advocated for the release of the two Michaels. Back in May, Johnston dismissed any notion Dong suggested China extend the detention of the two Michaels. Quote, "The allegation is false. Mr. Dong discussed the two Michaels with a PRC official, but did not suggest to the official that the PRC extend their detention," end quote, Johnston wrote. Quote, "Ministers and the Prime Minister went out of their way to defend Mr. Dong, whom they believe has been badly harmed by the reporting," end quote, the special rapporteur continued. Quote, "They did not believe the media reports when they came out, as they found Mr. Dong to be a loyal and helpful member of caucus. They received no recommendations about this allegation, as it is false," end quote. After the release of his report, Johnston admitted he did not interview Dong.
Now we join Mercedes Stevenson from Global News as she and her panel breaks down the week.
The public inquiry into foreign interference is back, and it has been a big week. For the first time, we're learning the details of what intelligence exactly the government had on the issue. The director of CSIS and the commissioner of the RCMP both testified about significant and numerous attempts by foreign governments to interfere in our democracy. From propaganda to China's attempt to funnel about $250,000 in cash to influence Canadian politics. And we learned new details about independent MP Han Dong and the comments he allegedly made about the two Michaels. A CSIS document alleged details of a phone call between Dong and China's consul general in Toronto. Dong testified that he didn't recall making the statements about the two Michaels alleged in the CSIS report and said that he had always advocated for their early release. One thing was clear in all of it: China is highly capable and motivated when it comes to election interference. Joining me now to discuss this are former National Security Advisor and CSIS Director Dick Fadden and the Globe and Mail's senior parliamentary reporter Stephen Chase, who's broken a number of the stories on foreign interference. A really remarkable week in terms of a chance to see documents Canadians would typically never lay eyes on, to hear from senior national security officials about what was happening behind the scenes. Steve, I know you've been tracking every moment of this as it goes by. What jumped out to you this week?
Well, first of all, what jumped out to me is that David Johnston really did a poor job. We learned so much more in 1 week of this inquiry than we've learned from his entire report. We had the revelations that there was serious concerns about Chinese disinformation campaigns being leveled against the Conservatives that were not passed on. We finally learned more about the conversation that Han Dong had with the Chinese consulate and the actual details of it. We had revelations about $250,000 being delivered from the Chinese government to threat actors in the region. So, and the week's not even over. The inquiry's not even over. We've got another week going.
So, if you recall, David Johnston, when he unveiled his report, immediately set out to say there's no need for a public inquiry. It's not going to be possible to have a public inquiry because of all the intelligence that's going to need to be presented, and it's not going to be able to be presented to the public, etc., etc., etc. He also said, if you recall, when he first went to accept this position, he was of a firm belief that there was going to be a public inquiry needed. But as he got into it, he changed his mind. One wonders if that came about as Justin Trudeau had a chat with him and said, we don't want a public inquiry because of what's going to be revealed. So this is where it's at. David Johnston, if it was up to Trudeau, that David Johnston special rapporteur fiasco would have just had Johnston meet with a few people to satisfy the public meeting aspect of it, and then this all would have been shelved, put to bed, and covered up. But now we are learning so many new details that wasn't disclosed, that the Conservatives didn't even know, that the public didn't even know because nothing was shared.
And of course, we're seeing public summaries of what would have been highly classified documents. We're not seeing the original documents or any of the things that we're not permitted to see for national security reasons. When you watch this through the national security lens, Dick, what does it all say to you about how significant this all was, and things that we've learned, as Steve points out, through this inquiry that we otherwise never would have known, and in some cases were denied by the government or by the Johnston report?
I think the main conclusion that I come to, which I find very distressing, is given everything that's been made public this week or quasi-public this week, in the context of the government's clear reluctance over time to admit that there was a problem. I mean, the government had to be driven to set up this inquiry. I still don't think they've really registered how serious it is substantively. It's certainly important publicly and in communication terms, but the thing that came across to me mostly was all of this information, or most of this information, should have been available quite broadly, not all publicly, but broadly within the system. Certainly the political side of things should have known about it, as should the senior public service. And despite all of this, as I said a moment ago, the government was very reluctant to deal with the issue, and they still are. You know, Mr. LeBlanc's been promising a foreign agents registry now, I think, for about 18 months. This is not a complicated piece of legislation.
So there you have Dick Fadden, or Richard Fadden, depending on how he wants to be addressed. And he was a deputy minister of national defense under Stephen Harper from May of 2013 to January of 2015. He was a director of CSIS from 2009 until 2013. He was Deputy Minister of Citizenship and Immigration from 2006 to 2009. And he's also served as National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister for both Trudeau and Harper from January 2015 up until March of 2016. So this is a guy that has really had his hands in this for the better part of a decade. So the fact that he is coming out and saying they've known about this for a long time and they didn't do anything, they haven't taken this seriously, it makes you ask the question, why? And the problem is there's no explanation being given from Trudeau's government as to why, so we are left to speculate, and the speculation isn't favorable in terms of how this Liberal government looks.
Is there any way they wouldn't have known some of this stuff? Because when you look back on some of the things that the government said a few months ago, and now you look at what's before the commission, did they never see this? Did they see this and think it would never come out so they could continue along their path? There's some pretty glaring deficiencies in the public commentary compared to what we now know. CSIS is saying, yes, we had analysis that suggested this and that it would have been passed on to appropriate authorities.
I mean, it's the job, for example, of PCO to make sure that when things like this come up, the Prime Minister and PMO and ministers are available. So I don't know why they've been reluctant to accept this in their public commentary, as you say, or to accept that they should have done something about it. But I've certainly come to the conclusion, having worked in Ottawa for a goodly number of years, that nothing stays secret forever. And I would have thought that that would have registered as well, but it seemingly hasn't, because you're right, the contrast between what they've said and what now appears to be the case, not quite congruent.
So again, Dick Fadden saying that what they were saying a year ago, oh, you know, there wasn't really any interference, don't worry about it, it's fine, nothing to see here. And then we're seeing all of this, right? And Dick Fadden is saying, this is something that CSIS, they said, well, yeah, we had these intelligence packages, we've passed them along. And remember Katie Telford, the Prime Minister reads everything that he's given. Of course he does. He's religious almost, as it relates to him reading these documents. And Dick Fadden saying, well, this is something that, goes to the Privy Council office, and the Privy Council office would pass that along to Justin Trudeau. So he knew. As Mercedes said, is there any way that he couldn't have known? And Dick Fadden is basically saying, no, there's no way that Trudeau didn't know that this stuff was going on. So why didn't he do anything?
Steve, what's the political fallout of this for the government?
Well, I think it shows that they weren't really on the job. Either there was a failure in communication, or there was a deliberate decision not to share information about the extent of the Chinese foreign interference. And let's be clear, 90% of what we're talking about here is Chinese state foreign interference. Although we've added other countries to the roster, we don't have a lot of evidence of other countries being as pervasive and aggressive.
There you go. They either didn't know what they were doing, or they deliberately withheld it. Either way, it's a very, very bad look. And this is what we've been saying from the beginning, in that they knew a lot more than has actually come out of these CSIS intelligence reports that have been released by the whistleblowers. Now, people were asking us back when they were releasing these reports from the whistleblowers, do we think that there's going to be more? And we said, well, if nothing is done, then yeah, we think more will come out. Now, we ended up with a public inquiry, so they didn't need to leak any more information, because this is evidently what the whistleblowers wanted, was a full public inquiry, an investigation into this, so that Canadians can actually see what the heck is going on. Well, now we're seeing what the heck is going on, and it sure as heck isn't good. So, and even though that Trudeau has, lumped in these other countries in terms of, we got to see all foreign interference, what we're seeing is that they account for a very small percentage of interference within our democracy. Now, that's still not insignificant, because any interference is bad. But again, Pareto principle, when more than 90% of it, and they're not going off by official stats here, it's just what have we been talking about the vast majority of the time? China. The vast majority of it has been coming from China. And we haven't done anything.
And it was the questions about China that initially sparked this inquiry. Of course, we've since started talking about India. Russia's been a persistent problem, Iran. It's a very broad scope, and I do want to get to that in a moment. But I wanted to ask you your opinion, Dick, on this information we got about the CSIS interception of the phone call between Han Dong and the Chinese Consul General. And this has been, a lot of controversy, a lot of debate about this phone call. We finally got the CSIS summary of what they allege was said, and it included things like concerns that the Canadian public wanted more transparency on the two Michaels being held, which of course is true. But you have Han Dong in it suggesting that if the Chinese government were to provide more transparency about the detention, it might placate public opinion. It might give the Liberal government some talking points, that if they were to release the two Michaels right now, it in fact might embolden opponents of the regime here in Canada and in the opposition who are hardliners on China. That was quite interesting to take a look at. When you look at that as a national security official, do you think that's an appropriate conversation if it unfolded that way? This is what CSIS says. If it unfolded the way that CSIS said it did.
Well, I have no reason to believe that what CSIS said did in fact not happen. And no, I don't think it's appropriate. MPs are entitled to have relationships with embassies. I mean, socially and professionally to some degree. But I think we have to look at the context. Canada was going through a really rough patch with China. We had two of our citizens being held. So anybody who was mucking around, complicating our relationships with China was doing so, I think, at variance with the best interest of both the country and the individuals concerned. I understand why Mr. Han Dong would be concerned, and he might want to help. It was not appropriate for a backbencher, in my view, at that time, to try and play. Even if you attribute the most positive of motives to him, anything that complicated what we were trying to do with the Chinese was not helpful.
Bingo. And that's what we've been saying since this was released. What was a backbencher doing talking to these guys? Now, I think the best case scenario for Han Dong in this case is that he was trying to elevate himself within the Liberal government, trying to score a win for himself so he can go back and say, hey, everybody, look what I did. And be celebrated for it, and then, maybe rise up the ranks within the Liberal government, maybe get a cabinet position. Who knows? But my goodness, not a good idea. Especially since what it seems like happened is that it led to the further detention of two Canadian citizens, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor. It is just absolutely insane. And then this guy got caught. It all went south. And his response is, I don't recall. And if you haven't seen our video on Han Dong's testimony this week, you have to go and watch it. Both of them. They are just shambolic in terms of his performance when he testifies.
And Han Dong, of course, was up testifying this week, the first time that we've heard from him in front of the commission. What did you think of what Mr. Dong had to say?
It was especially, I think, difficult for him when he was asked about these specific summaries of his conversation with the consul, and he couldn't recall advising them. He couldn't recall saying that, or didn't remember whether he had in fact advised them to that right now might not be a good time to release the Michaels, or that it might embolden the hardliners. And he didn't recall other very specific and tantalizing bits of the conversation. I don't think that came across well.
And there's, of course, the question of this $250,000 that CSIS believed, this essentially, I believe the commission lawyer called it a slush fund, that they were hoping to funnel through sort of a network of intermediaries to try to affect the election. And it's not clear whether that money ever actually changed hands, but that there was an intention to do so there. I wonder, Dick, when I look at all of this, and CSIS had all of this information, and they say that they passed it on to CITE, which is the elections body that's supposed to be monitoring and warning if there's an issue. Why didn't we hear anything about this publicly at the time, given what we now know?
I think that's a $57,000 question. I think there are basically three reasons. One, the way the site was constituted, it put senior public servants in this role. One of the things you're taught when you're a senior public servant is you stay as far away from elections as you possibly can. It's part of the DNA. And I think they would have been reluctant intuitively to make these things public. Secondly, I think the views of the Prime Minister at the time were that this was not a really significant issue. And I don't for a minute think that the Prime Minister told anybody, don't release things. But the views, the moods of ministers and Prime Ministers permeate the system. And I think that would have added a little bit to the reluctance. And the third reason, and I've felt this since the very beginning, I think I may have said this on one of your shows, I thought the constitution of SITE was wrong. I think that we would have been far better to have a retired politician, former Prime Minister Clark. He's not particularly partisan, but he's well respected. He understands elections in a way that none of these senior officials could have, or I could have. So I think for those three reasons, in the end, I think the problem would have had to be so serious that they would have felt compelled to release the information. The other issue, too, is I think their mandate wasn't as clear as it could have been. They interpreted it as requiring them to release information if there was a systemic issue, not if there was an issue, as Mr. O'Toole argues, at particular constituency levels.
So this is where we're at, folks. You have a former head of CSIS, former Deputy Minister of National Defense, former National Security Advisor. He's saying that as it relates to these intelligence documents that have been presented to the commission, he says, I have no reason to believe that what CSIS said happened didn't happen. Meaning, he's inclined to believe that it happened. So you have Han Dong caught between the rock and a hard place here. And this information, CSIS says, was pushed on. Every single report was pushed on to the Prime Minister's office. And then you have during the election, $250,000 allegedly was trying to be funneled in to the election by China. That went to, this magical the team that Trudeau had set up. Nobody told anybody. And this was affecting the NDP, this was affecting the Bloc, and this was also affecting the Conservatives. So there's a lot of dirt here, folks. And the biggest piece of dirt of all of this is that we are finding out what we've suspected all along, which is that the Trudeau government knew damn well everything that was going on and literally did nothing. We have precedent from Han Dong, from Aaron O'Toole, from Jenny Kwan, from the NDP, that the government knew about all of this stuff going on, and they said nothing, and then they did nothing. So this is going to be very, very bad. Next week, when the House is back in session, the Conservatives are going to be all over this. And I imagine the NDP are too, because this also affected the NDP, and this is a way for the NDP to start taking shots at Trudeau on this, as well as the Bloc. The Liberals are in for a firing squad when it comes to sitting in Parliament next week. And Trudeau gets to testify in front of the commission next week. And boy, oh boy, I hope they let him have it. But if they don't, we sure will.